The airport buzzed with that familiar hollow energy, a sound that always felt less like anticipation and more like 1,000 separate anxieties humming in unison. For years, that sound had been the prelude to something I told myself would be good, something that would finally mend the frayed edges of my family, stitch us back together with the golden thread of shared memories. This trip, this elaborate, expensive, carefully planned vacation, was supposed to be that thread. My daughter, Sarah, had chosen the destination, a sprawling resort in a place where the sun always shone, the kind of place that promised escape and effortless joy in the brochures. My son, Mark, had handled the bookings, with his usual air of efficient competence, that somehow always managed to make me feel slightly less capable. His wife, Jessica, had curated the itinerary, a packed schedule of activities that left little room for spontaneous moments, or frankly, for me to just sit and breathe. And Daniel, well, Daniel was my ex-husband. He wasn't technically part of the core planning, but Sarah insisted he come. "It's a family trip, Mom," she'd said, her voice layered with that particular sweetness that usually meant she was trying to manipulate me. It wouldn't be right without Dad. Right for whom? I always wondered. Right for them. Certainly. Daniel and I had been divorced for 15 years. 15 years marked by a steady, almost imperceptible erosion of whatever common ground we'd once shared, leaving only the rocky, difficult terrain of co-parenting adult children, who still, in their own ways, needed his approval more than mine, or perhaps knew how to get more out of him than out of me. I had paid for a significant portion of it, of course. Not all of it. They would never let me take full credit, but enough that it represented a substantial chunk of my savings, built slowly over years of quiet work after the divorce. It was my contribution, my investment in this fragile concept of family unity that felt increasingly like a performance I was expected to fund and applaud. As we checked in, the easy camaraderie between Daniel, Sarah, Mark, and Jessica was on full display. Laughing at some private joke, discussing seating arrangements with an airline representative who seemed entirely charmed by Mark's effortless authority, they moved as a unit. I stood slightly apart, a satellite orbiting their bright, self-contained star system. It wasn't malicious. Not overtly. It was just natural to them. Natural to exclude me, to forget to include me in the conversation, to make plans assuming I would simply fall into place. I reminded myself, as I had 1,000 times before, that they didn't mean it. They were busy. They were excited. They had their own dynamic. My internal monologue was a constant negotiation between the hope I desperately clung to and the quiet resignation that had become my oldest companion. I watched Daniel, still handsome in that rugged, slightly worn way, gesturing broadly as he talked about the resort's golf course. He hadn't changed. Still the charismatic center of attention, still capable of making everyone around him feel seen, except for the woman he'd once built a life with. He caught my eye for a fleeting second, offered a small, polite smile, the kind you give an acquaintance you bump into unexpectedly. It was a look that said, "We are here together, in proximity, but we are not together." The old familiar ache twisted in my stomach, a reminder of the woman I used to be, the woman who believed his smiles meant something real, something personal. That woman felt a lifetime away. The flight was long. I was seated separately, which was fine. I told myself, a chance to read, a chance to think. But mostly it was just another small indication of where I fit in their hierarchy of importance. Sarah and Jessica were together. Mark and Daniel were together. I was given an aisle seat several rows back, next to a young man with headphones who immediately fell asleep. I looked out the window as we flew, the world shrinking below, feeling strangely disconnected already, not just from the ground, but from the people I was traveling with. The glossy brochure image of sun-drenched relaxation seemed more like a distant planet than a destination we were actually headed towards. The journey had begun, not with a shared excited gasp at the takeoff, but with a quiet reaffirmation of my place on the periphery. And yet, I still held on to that fragile hope, that maybe, just maybe once we were there, away from the pressures of everyday life, something would shift. Maybe they would remember what family was supposed to feel like. Maybe they would remember me. The resort was objectively beautiful. Palm trees swayed like elegant dancers against a sky so blue it hurt your eyes. The air was thick with the scent of salt and some exotic floral sweetness. But even paradise can feel like a gilded cage if you're alone inside it. Our accommodations were villas scattered across the property. Sarah, Mark, Jessica, and Daniel were all in 2 adjacent villas near the main pool. Mine was further away, up a winding path, quieter. "We thought you'd like the peace and quiet, Mom," Sarah had said, her eyes wide and innocent. Peaceful. Yes. Quiet, definitely. Isolated. Absolutely. The first few days were a blur of their planned activities. They went snorkeling, they took a cooking class. They played beach volleyball. I was invited, of course. "Mom, you should come," Sarah would call out, already halfway down the path. But the invitations felt like obligations, tacked on as an afterthought. When I did try to join, I felt clumsy, slow, out of place. On the snorkeling trip, they were all effortless in the water, pointing things out to each other, laughing. I struggled with the mask, felt a faint panic at the depth, and eventually retreated to the boat, watching them from a distance. "Not really her thing, is it?" I heard Jessica say to Mark later, her voice low but carrying across the deck. Mark just grunted in agreement. It wasn't just the activities. It was the meals. They would gather at a large table, talking over each other, sharing stories, making plans for the evening. I would sit there trying to find a space to interject, to share something, anything. My attempts were met with polite nods before the conversation swept past me again. Daniel would sometimes ask me a question, usually about the house or a mutual acquaintance back home, things that anchored us in the past, never in the present shared moment. It was a perfunctory gesture, a public demonstration that he hadn't entirely forgotten I was there, but it lacked any real warmth or interest. The irony was a bitter taste in my mouth. Here we were, in this beautiful, expensive place, a picture of a happy family on vacation, but I had never felt more invisible, more disconnected. The internal monologue was getting louder now, harder to quiet. Why did I come? Why did I pay for this? Why do I keep putting myself through this? The hope I'd carried like a fragile bird seemed to be dying, its wings clipped by 1,000 small, thoughtless slights. I started spending more time at my villa, reading on the small patio, watching the geckos dart across the sun-warmed stones. I told myself I was enjoying the peace and quiet they had so thoughtfully arranged for me, but the quiet was just the absence of their noise, their laughter, their shared lives. And the peace was merely the stillness of being left alone. I saw them occasionally, heading out for dinner or returning from an excursion, a laughing, tanned group, a perfect tableau of familial bliss from a distance. As they got closer, the individual faces emerged, Sarah's bright smile, Mark's confident stride, Jessica's easy elegance, Daniel's familiar, comfortable presence among them. They were a unit, and I was simply not part of it. Not really. It was in these quiet moments, observing them from my self-imposed distance, that the resignation deepened its hold. This wasn't a temporary glitch. This was the reality of our relationship. I was the matriarch in name only, a figurehead who provided resources but wasn't truly integrated into the fabric of their lives. The bitterness began to curdle, slowly, inexorably replacing the faint, dying flutter of hope. Something had to give. I just didn't know what yet. The tension, unspoken but heavy, continued to build over the next few days. Every shared meal felt like an endurance test. Every group activity I opted out of felt like a small rebellion that went unnoticed. I was becoming a ghost at their feast, a silent observer of a family dynamic that had clearly shifted, leaving me stranded somewhere in the past. Then came the day of the boat trip. Jessica had chartered a large catamaran for a day of sailing, swimming, and a beach barbecue. It was meant to be the highlight of the trip, the quintessential tropical experience. I had initially said I would go, bracing myself for another day of smiling and trying to fit in. But that morning I woke up feeling utterly drained. The effort of pretending, of trying to bridge the distance they had created, felt monumental. I saw them gather by the resort's small dock from my villa balcony, a tableau bathed in the soft morning light. They were laughing, applying sunscreen to each other's backs, passing around bottles of water. A perfect, happy family heading out for a perfect day. And I felt nothing but a vast, aching emptiness, a profound sense of being utterly and completely alone, surrounded by the very people who were supposed to banish that feeling. I decided not to go. I called Sarah's villa phone. Jessica answered, her voice bright and cheerful. Hey. Ready? I hesitated for a moment. Hi, Jessica. No, actually, I don't think I'm going to make it. I'm feeling a bit under the weather. It wasn't entirely a lie. My heart ached, and my spirit felt sick. There was a beat of silence. Oh, Jessica said, the cheerfulness dimming slightly, replaced by a polite, almost practiced concern. Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. My name. Will you be okay? It wasn't a question that demanded a real answer. It was a formality. Yes, I'll be fine. Just need a quiet day. Okay, she said. Well, we'll miss you. I knew she wouldn't. Not really. Not in a way that mattered. Have fun, I said, and hung up before the emptiness in my voice could betray me. I watched from my balcony as they boarded the catamaran, waving to the crew, settling into their seats. They didn't look up towards my villa. They didn't wave goodbye. Why would they? I wasn't there. Not in their minds. Not really. I spent a day by myself. I swam in the smaller, quieter pool near my villa. I read my book. I walked along the deserted stretch of beach far from the main resort area. And I thought about the years, the decades I had spent trying to earn their approval, their affection, their simple acknowledgement. How I had sacrificed my own needs, my own desires, to be the mother, the wife, the ex-wife they wanted me to be. And for what? To be told I was under the weather and left alone without a second thought. The dead weight feeling, which had been a low hum beneath the surface of the trip, began to intensify. It wasn't just about being physically slow or tired. It was about feeling like an emotional burden, someone who slowed down their fun, who didn't quite fit their carefully curated image of a perfect family. I was the awkward footnote, the necessary but inconvenient attachment. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, I saw the catamaran returning in the distance. The sounds of laughter and music drifted across the water. They were coming back, full of stories and sunshine. And I dreaded their return. I dreaded having to hear about their wonderful day, having to feign enthusiasm, having to once again occupy my space on the periphery. The quiet determination that had started brewing after the under-the-weather phone call began to harden into something colder, something sharper. This wasn't just about a bad vacation. This was about a lifetime of being made to feel less than, of being taken for granted, of being invisible. And I couldn't do it anymore. The thought solidified, taking root deep within me. I couldn't spend another moment trying to make myself smaller, quieter, less of a burden so they could shine brighter. Something had to change. And for the first time, I realized I was the one who had the power to change it. The turning point, the precise moment the carefully constructed dam of my lifelong people-pleasing finally burst, didn't happen during a dramatic confrontation. Not at first anyway. It was quieter, more insidious, almost accidental. We were at dinner that night, gathered around a large table at the resort's main restaurant. They were recounting their day on the boat, full of energy and shared inside jokes. Sarah was showing photos on her phone. Daniel was holding court with a story about nearly losing his hat to a rogue wave. Mark and Jessica were laughing, their heads together. I tried to join in, mentioning a beautiful bird I'd seen near my villa. The conversation paused for a polite second, a collective, almost imperceptible shift in their focus towards me, before Mark smoothly pivoted back to the boat trip. You should have been there, Mom, he said, not unkindly, but with the easy dismissal of someone who genuinely believed I had missed out on something important by my own choice. It was amazing, though, he added, turning back to Daniel with a chuckle. We probably moved faster without having to wait for He trailed off, glancing at me, a half-formed thought dying on his lips. But Jessica picked it up, seamlessly. Oh, definitely, she chirped, smiling brightly. Much easier pace. We could just go, go, go. Honestly, she sighed theatrically, turning to Sarah, trying to get everyone organized, making sure everyone's comfortable. It can really slow things down, you know? Be a bit, well, dead weight. The words hung in the air for a split second. Dead weight. She said it so casually, so dismissively, as if discussing a piece of luggage that was slightly too heavy. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at Sarah, soliciting agreement. Sarah nodded, a small, knowing smile on her face. Daniel let out a short laugh, a puff of air that wasn't quite a sound of agreement, but certainly wasn't one of disagreement either. Mark was already scrolling through photos again, oblivious, or pretending to be. And in that moment, something inside me didn't just break. It shattered. It wasn't just the words themselves, though they were cruel in their casualness. It was the collective agreement, the easy acceptance among them that this was a true and valid assessment of my presence. Dead weight. Years of trying, of giving, of supporting, of loving, reduced to being an inconvenience, a burden that slowed them down. All those small slights, all those moments of feeling invisible, all the hope I'd clung to, it coalesced into a white-hot flash of pain, and then surprisingly, cold clarity. I looked at them, my children, the people I had dedicated my life to, my ex-husband, the man I had loved and built a family with. And I truly saw that they didn't see me. Not as a person with feelings, with needs, with a history that was inextricably linked to theirs. They saw me as a role, the mother, the provider, the occasional nuisance, the dead weight on their perfect vacation. My breath hitched, but I didn't cry. I felt remarkably, frighteningly calm. My mind, which had been racing with hurt and confusion for days, suddenly went quiet. A new voice emerged, clear and unwavering. No. It said, not anymore. I didn't make a scene. I didn't scream or throw my napkin down. I simply placed my fork quietly on my plate. Excuse me, I murmured, my voice barely audible above their conversation, which had already moved on. I think I'll retire for the evening. They barely registered my departure. Sarah offered a distracted, "Okay, Mom," without looking up. Mark just nodded. Jessica gave a little wave. Daniel, for his part, was mid-sentence telling another story. I walked away from the table, through the bustling restaurant, the sounds of their laughter fading behind me. Each step felt deliberate, heavy with a new unfamiliar weight, not the dead weight they perceived, but the weight of a decision forming, solidifying with every beat of my aching heart. I walked back to my villa, under the starlit sky. The resort was beautiful, yes, but it felt less like paradise now, and more like the stage for a play I was no longer willing to perform in. The air, once thick with the scent of flowers, now felt thin, difficult to breathe. I unlocked my door, the click of the lock echoing in the sudden silence. I was alone, but for the first time in a long time, that didn't feel entirely like a bad thing. The feeling of being dead weight hadn't just been a casual insult, it was a revelation. It was how they saw me. And if that was how they saw me, then maybe it was time I stopped trying to be part of their journey. Maybe it was time to find my own path, a path where I wasn't a burden, but simply myself. The anger, the hurt, the resignation, they were still there, simmering beneath the surface. But now, they were joined by a nascent sense of purpose, a quiet, steely resolve. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do yet, but I knew, with absolute certainty, that I wasn't going to be their dead weight anymore. The idea, initially a faint whisper in the back of my mind, began to take shape, growing bolder, more defined. The plane tickets? They had the return tickets. All of them. Or did they? A detail, seemingly insignificant at the time, surfaced in my memory. Mark had handled the booking. Yes, but he'd sent me copies of all the e-tickets just in case. He was nothing if not thorough, and I had printed them out, all 5 of them. just in case. They were in my carry-on, tucked away in a side pocket. A small stack of paper representing my path home. And perhaps, more importantly, there, the decision solidified in the quiet solitude of my villa. The hurt was still a raw wound, but the initial shock had given way to a profound, almost unsettling calm. They called me deadweight, and in saying it, they had inadvertently severed the last fragile tether that bound me to their expectations, to their narrative of who I supposed to be. I wasn't going to spend the rest of this expensive, humiliating trip being a specter at their feast. I wasn't going to fly back with them, enduring the long flight in silent agony, returning to a life where this pattern would simply repeat itself. The plane tickets. Mark had emailed them all to me. I'd printed them, a habit from a time when I didn't entirely trust digital copies. A time before everything was on phones and in clouds. They were tucked inside my carry-on bag, in the zippered front pocket, underneath a worn paperback novel I hadn't had the energy to read. I walked over to the bag, my movements slow and deliberate. My hands didn't tremble as I unzipped the pocket. I found the stack of folded paper, 5 separate e-tickets clearly printed, each with a name: Daniel, Sarah, Mark, Jessica, and mine. The return flight details, the seat numbers, the booking reference, all there. A tangible representation of our shared journey, or rather their journey that I was attached to. I pulled out my ticket, my name, flight number, date, time, my path back. Then I looked at the other 4. Daniel, Sarah, Mark, Jessica. Their paths back. A wave of something unexpected washed over me. Not just anger or hurt, but a strange, potent sense of power. For years I had felt powerless, beholden to their moods, their schedules, their acceptance. Now, holding these pieces of paper, I held something they needed, something vital. The irony was sharp, almost painful. They saw me as dead weight, a burden that slowed them down. But without these pieces of paper, they would be the ones weighed down, stuck, unable to move forward. The thought wasn't about revenge, not in a simple, petty way. It was about agency, about reclaiming control. If I left, I wouldn't just be walking away. I would be taking the means of their escape with me. It would force them to see me, not as dead weight, but as a person who could make decisions, who could act, who had leverage. It would force them to confront the consequences of their casual cruelty. The sheer audacity of the idea was exhilarating, terrifying, and utterly necessary. I knew, with a certainty that resonated bone deep, that this was what I had to do. I couldn't stay, and I wouldn't just quietly disappear. I would make my departure significant. I would make it impossible for them to ignore. I spent the next few hours packing. Not everything. Just a small bag with essentials, clothes for a few days, toiletries, my passport, my wallet, the printed tickets. The rest could stay. It felt like the baggage of a life I was leaving behind anyway. I moved efficiently, quietly. The silence of the villa, a stark contrast to the usual background noise of the resort. My mind was clear, focused solely on the task at hand. There was no room for doubt, no space for second guessing. This wasn't an impulsive decision, it was the culmination of years of unspoken pain and unacknowledged contribution. I thought about the house. I had made a home for them. The meals I had cooked, the late-night talks, the financial support, the emotional labor, all reduced to dead weight. The bitterness fueled my resolve. As the hour grew late, I checked online for flights leaving the island early the next morning. There was one, a direct flight to a major hub city, connecting to a flight back to my home city. It was expensive, a last-minute booking, but I had the savings. The savings I had contributed to this very vacation. I booked it using my own credit card, the click of the mouse feeling like a small act of rebellion. The digital ticket appeared instantly in my email. My own path home, secured by me, for me. I looked at the stack of 5 printed tickets again. Mine? Separate? In my email, there's tangible. In my hand, a knot of tension tightened in my chest. This was it. The point of no return. Taking their tickets wasn't just about inconvenience, it was symbolic. It was severing the cord, leaving them adrift, forced to navigate a consequence they had brought upon themselves. I placed their 4 tickets carefully in a sealed envelope. I would leave it somewhere. They would find it eventually, maybe with the resort manager, or slipped under the door of Sarah's villa after I was gone. A message, silent but clear. I wasn't their dead weight anymore. I was leaving, and I was taking their way home with me. The night felt long, but I didn't sleep. I sat on the patio, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the tropical night, watching the stars. I thought about the morning, about their confusion, their anger, their scramble to figure out what had happened. Part of me dreaded it, the inevitable accusations, the attempts to turn me into the villain, but a stronger part felt a sense of grim satisfaction. They would finally have to see me. They would finally have to acknowledge that the dead weight they so easily dismissed had substance, had agency, had the power to impact their lives in a way they hadn't anticipated. The inversion of the power dynamic was subtle, almost hidden, contained within a small stack of paper, but its potential impact felt immense. I was no longer the one waiting to be included, hoping for acknowledgement, trying to keep up. I was the one making a move, setting the terms, forcing them to react. The bittersweet reality was that this act, while empowering for me, would likely sever the relationship with them entirely. But was there truly a relationship there to sever? Or just a performance I was exiting? The answer, chillingly, felt clear. There wasn't much left to lose. The morning arrived, soft and gray at first, then brightening quickly as the sun climbed above the horizon. My small bag stood by the door, ready. My heart was a tight knot in my chest, a mix of fear and resolute determination. I had the envelope with their tickets. I knew I couldn't just walk out without leaving them something, a breadcrumb trail, a confirmation that this wasn't an accident or a disappearance, but a deliberate act. I decided to leave the envelope with the resort's front desk. They would be responsible for handing it over, removing me from the immediate confrontation. It felt like a small act of self-preservation, a way to maintain the fragile composure I had built. I walked out of the villa, closing the door softly behind me. The air was fresh, still cool from the night. The resort was just beginning to stir. Early risers were heading for the beach. Staff were quietly tending to the gardens. I felt like a spy in plain sight, an alien in a familiar setting. I walked towards the main reception area, my pace steady. My mind replayed the moment Jessica had uttered those words, the casual cruelty of them, the way the others had silently agreed. It was like a shield, protecting me from the doubt that tried to creep in. The voice that whispered, "Are you sure? Are you really doing this?" Yes, I was sure. More sure of this than almost anything else I had done in years. At the front desk, a young woman with a sleepy smile greeted me. "Good morning, madam." "Good morning," I replied, my voice a little husky. "I have an early flight. I'd like to check out." She processed my request efficiently. As she handed me the final bill, I produced the envelope. "Could I ask you to do me a favor?" I asked. "Of course." "My family," I said, the word feeling strangely foreign on my tongue. "They are in Villa 2B and 2C. They have the return flights booked under the name Daniel's last name. These are their tickets. Would you be so kind as to hold on to this envelope and give it to them when they inquire about me, or when they come to check out?" I made sure to sound calm, polite, like this was a perfectly normal request. The young woman looked slightly confused, but she took the envelope. "Certainly, madam. I will note it here." She scribbled something on a form. "Is there anything else?" "No, that's all. Thank you." I paid the bill, slung my bag over my shoulder, and walked out of the reception area. Stepping outside, into the growing daylight, felt like stepping into a new world. The air felt different, lighter. I didn't have to perform anymore. I didn't have to smile when I was hurting, or pretend to be interested when I was bored, or make myself smaller so I wouldn't be a burden. I hailed a taxi from the stand outside the resort gates. As the taxi pulled away, I looked back at the resort receding behind me. The palm trees, the villas, the perfect, sun-drenched facade. It looked like a postcard, a picture of a life I was leaving behind, a picture that had never quite matched the reality. The drive to the airport was quiet. I watched the scenery pass by, the unfamiliar landscape, a soothing distraction. My thoughts were a jumble of emotions: relief, sadness, a tremor of fear, but also, undeniably, a growing sense of exhilaration. I was doing this. I was choosing myself. I was walking away from a dynamic that had chipped away at my self-worth for decades. At the airport, I navigated check-in and security on my own. It felt strange, being alone, but also oddly liberating. No waiting for others, no coordinating schedules, no trying to keep up, just me, my bag, and my own path forward. As I sat at the gate waiting to board, I imagined their reaction. The initial confusion when they realized I wasn't at breakfast or by the pool, the calls to my villa, the unanswered phone, the growing alarm, and then the trip to the front desk, the inevitable conversation with the resort staff, the moment they would be handed the envelope, the realization that I had taken their tickets. I knew there would be anger, accusations. They would call me selfish, cruel, dramatic. They would twist the narrative, making themselves the victims and me the villain. But for the first time, their opinion of me felt less like a judgment and more like background noise. Their words had lost their power. They had already called me the worst thing they could think of: dead weight. What more could they say that would hurt me? Their insult had become my liberation. The loudspeaker announced boarding for my flight. I stood up, my legs feeling steady. I wasn't running away. I was walking towards something. Towards a future where I was no longer defined by their gaze, no longer measured by my perceived value to them. The weight that had been lifted wasn't just the perceived dead weight I carried in their eyes. It was the crushing weight of their expectations, their indifference, their inability to truly see me. As I walked down the jet bridge, I felt a bittersweet pang. This was the end of an era, the severing of ties that, however painful, were still ties. But as I stepped onto the plane, I also felt something else, something new and powerful blooming in my chest. Resilience, self-worth, the quiet strength of a woman who had finally decided that her own well-being was worth more than the illusion of a perfect family. The plane soared into the sky, leaving the island, and them, behind. Looking down at the receding coastline, I wasn't just leaving a vacation. I was leaving a lifetime of trying to be enough for people who would never truly see me. And the view from up here, alone in the sky, felt vast and full of possibility. The phone calls started before I even landed. Missed calls piling up, voicemails flooding in. The first few were from Sarah, a mix of confusion and concern. "Mom, where are you? We can't find you. Call us back." Then the tone shifted. As they likely discovered the tickets were missing and pieced together my departure, the messages turned frantic, then angry. Mark left a terse, demanding voicemail. "Mom, what the hell? The resort said you checked out, and they gave us this envelope. What do you think you're doing? You took our tickets? This is unbelievable." Jessica's message was dripping with saccharine disappointment layered over fury. "We are all so worried about you." My name. "But taking the tickets? That's nothing. That's really out of line. You've left us in a terrible situation. How could you?" And Daniel, his voice, usually so smooth and controlled, was tight with disbelief and frustration. "What is the meaning of this? Leaving like that? And the tickets? You need to call us immediately and explain yourself. This is completely unacceptable." Unacceptable. The word echoed in my mind. Unacceptable that I would inconvenience them. Unacceptable that I would deviate from the script they had written for me. Unacceptable that the dead weight had suddenly developed the ability to walk away and carry something vital with her. I listened to the messages in the sterile silence of the airport waiting area during my layover. Each word, meant to wound or manipulate, instead felt like confirmation. Confirmation that I had done the right thing. Their outrage wasn't about my well-being. It was about their inconvenience, their thwarted plans, their loss of control. They didn't ask why I left. They demanded to know how I dared to leave them in a difficult position. There was no acknowledgement of their behavior, no questioning of what might have driven me to this point. Only self-pity and anger directed squarely at me. The irony was almost comical. They had called me dead weight, incapable of keeping up, slowing them down. Yet by taking the tickets, I had immobilized them. I had shifted the burden from my shoulders to theirs. And in doing so, I felt lighter than I had in years. I didn't call them back. Not then. Not for a long time. What was there to say? You called me dead weight, so I decided to stop weighing you down. They wouldn't understand. They would twist it, deny it, make it my fault. Their inability to see their own reflection in this situation was part of the problem. They genuinely seemed incapable of comprehending that their actions, their words, had consequences for me. Their casual cruelty was so ingrained, so natural to them, that they didn't even recognize it as cruelty. It was just how things were. My return home was quiet and solitary. Stepping back into my empty house felt strange after being surrounded by family, however distant that proximity had felt. The silence of my own home was different from the isolating quiet of the villa. This silence was peaceful, a space where I could finally hear my own thoughts without the cacophony of their expectations and demands. I allowed myself time to simply be, to process the whirlwind of emotions. The hurt was still there, a dull ache, but it was no longer debilitating. The anger had cooled into a quiet resolve. The resignation had been replaced by a budding sense of empowerment. I thought about the symbolic object, the house. My house. The place I had built my life after the divorce. The place they visited for holidays, for birthdays, often treating it more like a hotel they were doing me a favor by staying in than a home I had created. It was my anchor, my safe harbor. And now, it felt even more profoundly mine, a space untouched by their judgment, their dismissiveness. They continued to try and contact me. Texts, emails, messages through mutual acquaintances who were clearly uncomfortable intermediaries. Their tone shifted again, moving from anger to a kind of bewildered cajoling. Mom, this isn't like you. Let's just talk about this. We're worried? It was another performance, an attempt to reel me back in using guilt and feigned concern. I ignored most of it. I knew that engaging would just pull me back into the same old dynamic, the same old dance where I was always out of step. I wasn't ready to explain, to justify, to defend myself. I was still finding my footing on this new path. Leaving wasn't just about the tickets. It was about leaving the role they had assigned me. It was about refusing to be the dead weight anymore. It was about proving to myself more than anyone else that I had substance, I had value, and I deserved to be treated with respect. The act of taking their tickets, of forcing them into inconvenience, was a stark, undeniable message. A message delivered not with words but with action. And for the first time, I felt truly seen, not by them but by myself. The view wasn't perfect. There was still pain, still uncertainty, but it was mine. And it was a view of a future I was finally building for myself. The immediate aftermath was a period of intense, unwelcome drama. My phone, usually a quiet companion, became a source of constant noise and anxiety. They escalated their attempts to contact me, moving from individual calls to group messages, from voicemails to emails, each communication more demanding than the last. The attempts to manipulate were thinly veiled. "We're stuck here because of you," Mark texted, conveniently omitting the part where they could simply buy new tickets. "Do you have any idea how much this is costing us?" Sarah, ever the diplomat, tried a different approach. "Mom, please, this is tearing us apart. Don't you care about us? Care about them?" The question struck a raw nerve. Of course I cared about them. I had dedicated my life to caring for them, but caring for them had somehow become synonymous with neglecting myself, with allowing myself to be diminished. Jessica, predictably, leaned into the victim role. "It's just been awful here. Everything is ruined. We were supposed to have this wonderful family time, and you just... Tainza. Disciples left. How could you do this to us? It was a masterpiece of inversion. They were the wronged party. I was the heartless villain. I responded sparingly, usually with a brief text stating I needed space and time. My silence seemed to infuriate them further. They couldn't control me if they couldn't get a reaction. Then came the calls from others. My sister, gently prodding, "Your kids are worried." You know? A friend of Daniel's, clearly put up to it, asking if I was all right in a tone that suggested I had lost my mind. The resort manager even called, awkwardly confirming that the family in Villas 2B and 2C had indeed received the envelope and were experiencing some inconvenience. It was a cascade of external pressure, all designed to pull me back into line, to make me regret my actions, to force me to resume my role as the compliant, easily dismissed mother. But their efforts had the opposite effect. Each manipulative message, each thinly veiled accusation, reinforced the validity of my decision. This wasn't just about a vacation gone wrong. It was about the fundamental imbalance in our relationship. They felt entitled to my resources, my presence, my unwavering support, but offered little in return except conditional acceptance and casual disregard. The deadweight comment, in its bluntness, had ripped away the facade. It had revealed the transactional nature of their affection. My quiet strength, the quality the JSON profile mentioned, was tested daily. It wasn't a loud, defiant strength, but a quiet internal one. The strength to withstand the barrage of criticism, the strength to sit with the discomfort of their anger, the strength to trust my own judgment even when everyone else was telling me I was wrong. I reflected constantly on the years leading up to this, the subtle ways they had minimized me, the times I had felt like a burden, the moments I had swallowed my feelings to maintain the peace. The time Mark had borrowed a significant sum of money for a down payment and taken years to repay it, always with an air of doing me a favor by eventually paying it back. The countless holidays Sarah had insisted I host, only to spend the entire time on her phone, barely engaging. Daniel's consistent pattern of treating me with a polite distance that screamed indifference, yet expecting me to be available as a free babysitter or a convenient extra hand whenever needed. These weren't isolated incidents. They were the threads of a pattern that had woven itself into the fabric of our family life. The vacation hadn't created the dynamic. It had merely provided the stage for its most brutal manifestation. I realized the tickets were more than just plane tickets. They were a symbol of freedom, my freedom, purchased with my own quiet act of rebellion, and their inconvenience was a tangible consequence of their actions, a forced moment of reflection that they would likely resist with every fiber of their being. Days turned into a week. I learned through the grapevine. The friend of Daniel's was surprisingly chatty once she realized I wasn't going to have a breakdown, that they had managed to book new flights at considerable expense and at significant difficulty. They were back home. The immediate crisis was over for them. But for me, the journey was just beginning. I knew the hard part wasn't leaving. It was living with the aftermath, navigating the ruptured relationships. But there was also an unexpected sense of peace. The raw wound of hurt was slowly healing, replaced by a scar that was a testament to my resilience. The anger had transformed into a quiet determination to protect my newfound sense of self-worth. I wasn't dead weight. I was a woman who had finally chosen to stand up for herself, to walk away from a situation that was destroying her spirit. The inversion of the power dynamic had been temporary, a shock to their system. But the lasting inversion was internal. I had taken back my power, not by controlling them, but by controlling my own response, my own path. The bitter taste of betrayal was still there, but now it was mingled with the sweet, invigorating taste of liberation. I was ready to face whatever came next, not as the dead weight they saw, but as the strong, resilient woman I was finally allowing myself to be. The quiet defiance of my silence seemed to work initially, creating a buffer zone after their return. The frantic calls and demanding texts tapered off, replaced by a tense quiet. It felt like the eye of a storm. I knew it wouldn't last. The family dynamic, however dysfunctional, had a certain inertia, a tendency to snap back into its established patterns. And in our pattern, I was the one who absorbed the slights, who facilitated their lives, who remained reliably, predictably there. My leaving, my taking of the tickets, had been a seismic disruption, and they were not equipped to process it in a healthy way. They were equipped to deflect, to blame, to reassert control. The next phase of their strategy became apparent a few weeks later. There wasn't a direct confrontation, but a more insidious campaign, whispered through the usual channels. Mark started telling mutual acquaintances that I had a breakdown on vacation, that I wasn't myself. Sarah expressed concern for my mental state to her aunts and uncles, painting a picture of a fragile woman who had acted impulsively and irrationally. Jessica, ever the martyr, spoke of the trauma I had inflicted on the family, the stress, the financial burden of the new tickets. Daniel, the smooth operator, adopted a tone of weary disappointment, sighing about how difficult things had become and how he just wanted to help me. They were rewriting the narrative, framing my act of self-preservation as evidence of my instability. It was a calculated move, designed to isolate me, to undermine my credibility, to turn me into the villain in our story. This campaign, conducted at a distance, was almost more painful than the direct attacks. It was a betrayal that seeped into my social circle, subtly poisoning relationships, casting a shadow of doubt over my character. I heard echoes of it through well-meaning friends who called ostensibly to check on me, but with questions laced with their doubts. "Are you feeling better, dear? Must have been a very stressful trip. Your children are quite worried about you." You know, the unspoken accusation hung heavy in the air. That I was unstable, that I was wrong, that I had hurt them for no good reason. This was the dark part of the redemptive arc, the period where the consequences of my actions felt heavy, where the isolation threatened to overwhelm the empowerment. There were moments of doubt, flashes of vulnerability, where I questioned myself. Had I overreacted? Was I being selfish? The internal versus external conflict was intense. Inside, I knew with absolute clarity why I had left. I knew the years of hurt, the feeling of being dead weight, the slow erosion of my spirit. But externally I was being painted as unbalanced, irrational, cruel. It took a conscious, sustained effort to hold on to my truth, to trust my own experience over their manufactured narrative. I limited contact, politely but firmly shutting down conversations that delved into the vacation drama. I chose carefully who I spoke to, confiding in a few trusted friends who listened without judgment. I focused on rebuilding my life, finding joy in simple things, gardening, reading, reconnecting with old hobbies I had let slide. The symbolic object of the house became even more important during this time. It was my sanctuary, a physical representation of my independence. I spent hours in the garden, digging, planting, nurturing new life. It was a meditative process, a way to ground myself amidst the emotional turbulence. I also started seeking legal advice, quietly, cautiously, not necessarily to sue them, but to understand my rights, to protect myself financially and legally from any potential retaliation, though I wasn't entirely sure what form that might take. A consultation with a calm, pragmatic lawyer helped solidify my sense of agency. Discussing asset protection, wills, and future financial independence felt like building a sturdy foundation for my new life. It wasn't dramatic or emotional, but it was profoundly empowering. It was practical proof that I was taking control of my future, not just reacting to the past. I thought about the tickets again. Those 4 pieces of paper left in an envelope at a resort desk thousands of miles away. They were the catalyst, the undeniable proof of my departure. But the real journey had been internal, a slow, arduous climb from feeling invisible to reclaiming my voice. The deadweight comment had been the brutal truth I needed to hear, however painful it was. It had stripped away the illusion of a close-knit family and revealed the necessity of prioritizing my own well-being. This period of quiet battle, of weathering the storm of their manufactured narrative, was crucial. It forced me to rely on my inner strength, the strength I had always possessed but had kept hidden, buried beneath layers of obligation and expectation. It was bittersweet. The potential loss of my children's active presence in my life was a heavy price. But the gainer, the rediscovery of myself, the freedom from their judgment, the quiet confidence that bloomed in the space their absence created, felt invaluable. I was no longer defined by their perception of me. I was defining myself. And that felt like the most significant power inversion of all. As the months passed, the intensity of the family drama slowly subsided. The constant barrage of messages stopped. The attempts to manipulate through intermediaries became less frequent. A new kind of normal settled in, one marked by a vast, empty space where our relationship used to be. There were occasional perfunctory text messages, "Merry Christmas," "Happy Birthday," brief, hollow exchanges that underscored the distance between us. They were polite, carefully neutral, devoid of any real warmth or genuine connection. It was clear they had not processed the events of the vacation, or their role in them. There was no apology, no attempt at understanding, just a cold silence punctuated by obligatory greetings. This silence, while initially a relief after the storm, was also a form of grief. The dream of a close, loving family, however unrealistic it had become, was truly dead now. It was a bittersweet reality. I had gained my freedom, my self-respect, my agency, but I had lost the illusion of the family I had always longed for. It was a dark outcome, in terms of familial connection, but redemptive for my own spirit. I spent a lot of time in reflection. During this period, I thought about my younger self. The woman who had married Daniel, who had started a family with such hope and optimism. Where had it all gone wrong? Was it gradual erosion, or had the cracks always been there, papered over by my desperate need to believe in the fairy tale? I realized that the dynamic of being undervalued, of being dead weight in their eyes, wasn't new. It had always been there, a subtle undercurrent in our interactions, growing stronger over time. Daniel's tendency to dismiss my opinions, Sarah's effortless manipulation, Mark's casual disregard, Jessica's performative pleasantness, masking a deeper indifference. It was a pattern I had enabled for years, mistaking their need for me for love or respect. The symbolic objects in my life took on new meaning. The house wasn't just an anchor, it was a monument to my resilience. A physical space I had claimed and nurtured for myself. The tickets, long since discarded, remained a powerful internal symbol of the moment I had broken free, the tangible representation of my refusal to be held captive by their expectations. I started doing things I had always wanted to do, but had never made time for. I took a pottery class, finding a quiet joy in working with my hands. I joined a walking group, discovering the simple pleasure of shared silence and companionship. I reconnected with old friends, people who saw me for who I was, not for my role within a family dynamic. I learned to enjoy my own company, to find fulfillment in activities that were solely for me, not for the benefit or approval of others. The process wasn't easy. There were days filled with sadness, with longing for the way things could have been, or the way I had imagined them to be. But even in those moments, the quiet sense of empowerment remained. I had faced a painful truth and acted on it, choosing my own well-being over maintaining a destructive status quo. One day, prompted by something I saw, I went through old photo albums, pictures of the children when they were small, pictures of Daniel and me from decades ago, smiling younger, full of hope. It was like looking at strangers. The memories were bittersweet, tinged with the knowledge of how things had turned out, but I found that I could look at them now without the overwhelming ache. There was a detachment, a recognition that the past was a foreign country, and I couldn't live there anymore. The person in those photos, the woman who tried so hard, who gave so much, had led me to this point. And while I felt a pang of sadness for her, I also felt a profound sense of gratitude. Her sacrifices, her endurance, her eventual breaking point, they had paved the way for the woman I was becoming. The woman who was no longer dead weight, but vibrant, alive, and free. There was no grand reconciliation, No Hollywood ending where the family saw the error of their ways and welcomed me back with open arms. That kind of resolution felt impossible, given the depth of their denial and my own need for authentic connection. Instead, there was quiet acceptance. Acceptance of the fractured reality of my family.
Acceptance of the fact that sometimes walking away is the strongest thing you can do.
The empowered feeling wasn't a constant rush of adrenaline. It was a quiet, steady hum beneath the surface of my life. It was the knowledge that I had survived, that I had faced a profound betrayal and emerged not unscathed but stronger, wiser, and more resilient. I was no longer defined by my relationship with them or their perception of me. I was defined by my own choices, my own strength, my own path forward. The dead weight had not only walked away, she had soared. And the view from up here, alone but free, was breathtaking. The silence from my family became a new normal, a quiet landscape devoid of their particular brand of noise and manipulation. It was punctuated occasionally by the brief distant greetings on holidays, like signals from a ship that had long since sailed away. I didn't initiate contact, and they didn't either, beyond the perfunctory. It was a standoff, perhaps, or simply the natural state of our relationship, once the performance of familial closeness had been abandoned. I heard about their lives in snippets, through the same channels that had once been used to subtly undermine me. Mark got a promotion. Sarah's daughter started school. Daniel was dating someone new. Their lives continued, as did mine, parallel paths that rarely intersected. And I found that hearing about them, from a distance, without the emotional entanglement, felt different. It was like hearing about characters in a book I used to read, a story I was no longer a part of. The raw wound had healed, leaving a scar that was a reminder, not of the pain itself, but of the strength it had taken to survive it. The bittersweet nature of it all remained. There was a sadness for the loss of what could have been, for the idealized family unit that had never truly existed. But that sadness was tempered by the profound sense of peace and freedom I had gained. I was no longer waiting for their call, no longer hoping for their approval, no longer molding myself into the shape they wanted me to be. I was simply, unapologetically myself. The experience had irrevocably changed me. The quiet strength that had been a hidden quality was now my most prominent feature. I was less afraid of confrontation, more willing to set boundaries, more attuned to my own needs and feelings. The period of being painted as unstable by them had forced me to truly solidify my own sense of reality, to trust my own judgment above all else. It had been a painful trial by fire, but I had emerged with an inner resilience I hadn't known I possessed. The symbolic objects continued to hold meaning. My house was no longer just a home, it was a fortress of solitude and self-sufficiency. The memory of the tickets and the act of taking them was a potent reminder of my ability to act decisively, to take control of my own destiny. It was a callback to the moment everything had changed, a tangible representation of an internal revolution. I found myself thinking often about the deadweight comment. Those two words, so casually tossed into conversation, had been the catalyst. They had been meant to diminish me, to highlight my perceived shortcomings, to justify their exclusion of me, but they had done the opposite. They had illuminated the truth of our dynamic and given me the clarity I needed to break free. There was an immense irony in it. Their attempt to label me as burdensome had resulted in the ultimate redistribution of the burden. They were left to deal with the consequences of their actions, while I was free to pursue a lighter, more authentic life. My life now wasn't marked by grand dramatic events, but by quiet joys and a steady sense of purpose. I continued with my pottery, creating pieces that were beautiful and functional, tangible proof of my ability to shape something meaningful with my own hands. I traveled, sometimes with my walking group, sometimes alone, exploring places I had always wanted to see, not as a tag-along, but as the architect of my own adventures. I invested in myself, in my hobbies, in my well-being. It felt strange at first, this unapologetic focus on myself, after so many years of prioritizing others, but it also felt deeply, profoundly right. There was a redemptive quality to this phase of my life, It wasn't about vengeance or making them suffer, though the initial inconvenience of the tickets had certainly served a purpose in forcing them to acknowledge my existence. It was about redemption for myself, reclaiming the parts of me that had been suppressed or ignored. It was about building a future based on my own values, my own desires, my own strength. The family fallout was a permanent change. We might never have the close relationship I had once dreamed of, but I had come to accept that the cost of maintaining that illusion was too high. The betrayal had been deep, the pain real, but the liberation that followed was equally profound. I was no longer the dead weight in their story. I was the protagonist in my own. And my story was unfolding, day by day, filled with quiet resilience, bittersweet reflection, and a powerful, unshakable sense of empowerment. The journey wasn't over, of course. Life continued to present challenges, but I faced them now from a place of strength, anchored by the knowledge that I had survived the storm and found my own way to shore. The woman who had quietly walked away from a tropical resort, taking the plane tickets with her, was not the same woman who had arrived full of fragile hope. She was stronger, wiser, and finally, truly free. The passage of time continued to soften the edges of the acute pain, leaving behind a different kind of landscape, one of quiet reflection and enduring resilience. The emotional tone had shifted from raw betrayal to a more settled, albeit bittersweet, acceptance. My life had found a new rhythm, one dictated by my own needs and desires, free from the constant underlying tension of trying to fit into a mold that was never meant for me. I still thought about the vacation, about the deadweight comment, and the moment I had walked away. Those memories were etched into me, not as sources of lingering bitterness, but as markers on a journey. They were the defining moments of a personal revolution, the catalyst that had propelled me into a new phase of life. The irony of their words continued to resonate. They had perceived me as a burden, a drag on their speed and enjoyment. Yet, by vocalizing that perception, they had inadvertently given me the permission, the reason, to shed that perceived weight and soar on my own. The inversion of power dynamic wasn't just a temporary shock. It was a fundamental shift in my own relationship with power. I no longer sought validation from external sources, least of all from those who had so clearly demonstrated their inability to provide it. My power came from within, from my capacity to endure, to choose, to create my own path. The supporting characters in my drama, Sarah, Mark, Jessica, Daniel, remained on the periphery of my life. There were no dramatic reconciliations, no heartfelt apologies that mended everything. That kind of closure felt less and less necessary as I moved forward. What I needed wasn't their validation. It was my own peace. And I had found it. The symbolic objects of my narrative continued to hold their weight. My house remained my sanctuary, a testament to my independence. The tickets, or rather the act of taking them, was a constant reminder of my agency, a symbol of the moment I had chosen myself. It wasn't about leaving them stranded. It was about unstranding myself from a life where I felt trapped and undervalued. I explored the darker, redemptive aspects of my journey in quiet ways. I allowed myself to acknowledge the pain, the betrayal, the unfairness of it all, without letting it consume me. I understood that their inability to see me, to value me, was their limitation, not mine. And in that understanding, there was a form of redemption. I had redeemed myself from the narrative they had imposed upon me. I had shed the skin of the dead weight and stepped into the light as a woman who was capable, resilient, and worthy. My relationship with myself had become the most important one. I listened to my own needs, honored my own feelings, prioritized my own well-being. It wasn't selfish. It was necessary. It was the foundation upon which I was building a life that was truly mine. The long, descriptive sentences I used to analyze my internal landscape felt natural now, a reflection of the depth of my emotional journey. The short, emotional punches were the echoes of moments of pain and clarity, sharp reminders of how far I had come. The rhetorical questions I had asked myself in the darkest moments. Why do I keep putting myself through this? For what? Now had answered. I had put myself through it because I hadn't known I had a choice. and I had done it for the illusory hope of acceptance. But the answer now was that I didn't have to put myself through it anymore. My life was mine to live, on my own terms. The language style remained simple, narrative-rich, focused on articulating the complex tapestry of my emotions without jargon or pretense. It was the language of truth, stripped bare of the performances and pretenses that had defined my past interaction. The emotional tone had settled into a steady state of empowered peace, tinged with the lingering, bittersweet awareness of what had been lost. But the loss was for the best. It had cleared the way for a future that was entirely my own making. There was no final dramatic scene with my family. No moment of reckoning where they apologized or I delivered a cathartic monologue. Life wasn't that neat. The true drama had unfolded within me, a slow burn emotional process that had culminated in a single decisive act. The legacy of the vacation, of the deadweight comment and the missing tickets, wasn't one of ongoing conflict, but one of quiet transformation. I was a woman who had been undervalued, betrayed, and left feeling like a burden. But I had found my strength, asserted my worth, and walked away, carrying not the weight of their expectations, but the light of my own liberation. My story was a testament to the power of choosing yourself, even when that choice comes at a great cost. It was a story of resilience, of finding redemption in the aftermath of betrayal, and of discovering that the strongest foundation you can build is the one within yourself. The path forward was not without its challenges, but I faced them with a quiet confidence, a knowing smile, and the deep abiding peace of a woman who was finally, truly free. The final chapter of this particular story wasn't about a destination reached, but a state of being achieved. The raw intensity of the initial betrayal and the subsequent fallout had faded into a more muted reflection, a kind of acceptance that settled deep within my bones. My life continued, marked by small personal victories rather than grand, external validations. I found solace in routine, joy in quiet moments, and strength in my own company. The absence of my family's active presence in my life was no longer a gaping wound, but a quiet space that I had filled with my own interests and connections. I cultivated friendships with people who saw and appreciated me for who I was, without the baggage of shared history or tangled expectations. These relationships were built on mutual respect and genuine affection, a stark contrast to the conditional and transactional nature of my familial ties. The deadweight comment, once a source of searing pain, had transformed into a strange kind of mantra, a reminder of the lowest point that had propelled me towards empowerment. It was the ultimate irony, the cruelest words becoming the key to my liberation. I understood now that their perception of me wasn't a reflection of my worth, but a reflection of their own limitations, their own inability to value someone who didn't serve their immediate needs. The narrative I was living was entirely my own, written with intentionality and courage. I was no longer a supporting character in their story. I was the protagonist in mine. The slow burn emotional tension that had defined the lead up to the vacation, and the period immediately following my departure, had dissipated. It was replaced by a steady underlying current of peace. There were still moments of sadness, a nostalgic pang for the family unit I had always yearned for. But these moments were fleeting. They were overshadowed by the profound sense of relief and freedom that permeated my daily life. The house, my sanctuary, continued to be a central symbol of my independence and resilience. It was a physical manifestation of the life I had built for myself, piece by piece, after the divorce, and most significantly, after the vacation. It was a space where I was wholly and completely myself, without apology or explanation. The memory of the plane tickets, and the decisive act of taking them, remained a powerful internal touchstone. It was a reminder of the moment I had seized control, disrupted the status quo, and forced a reckoning, not just for them but for myself. It was the symbolic inversion of the power dynamic, a move that had reshaped the trajectory of my life. My journey wasn't about getting revenge in a conventional sense, though their inconvenience had been a necessary consequence. It was about reclaiming my own life, about refusing to be defined by others' limitations, about finding the strength to walk away from a situation that was slowly destroying my spirit. The dark period of weathering their backlash had forged a resilience within me that was unbreakable. It taught me to trust my own instincts, to rely on my inner compass, even when external forces tried to pull me off course. The redemption wasn't about being forgiven or accepted by them. It was about forgiving myself for allowing the situation to continue for so long, and accepting myself for who I was, flaws and all. I was older now, perhaps a little worn by the journey, but infused with a quiet confidence that felt like a superpower. The quiet strength mentioned in the Jason profile was not just a description, it was the essence of who I had become. I had faced betrayal, endured emotional neglect, and emerged with my spirit intact, stronger and more self-aware than ever before. My story was a testament to the fact that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to walk away. To recognize when a dynamic is toxic, when your presence is taken for granted, and to have the courage to chart a new course. I was no longer dead weight. I was a woman who had shed the weight of expectation, disappointment, and invalidation, and in doing so, had discovered the boundless strength and freedom that lay within. The view from here, from this place of quiet empowerment and profound self-acceptance, was not just breathtaking. It was home.